Hello friends, today I'll be talking about research method in social sciences. I'll give you a broad introductory overview of research methods. But before that, I would like to thank HRDC JNU for inviting me, especially Professor Sanjay Bhardwaj, who asked me to come and deliver this lecture. So in today's lecture, I'll be talking about 4 cardinal things of research method. As you know, you cannot do research without these points or these components. One is the research question. Second is the theory, third is the data, and the fourth one is the data analysis. So the moment anybody talks of research, these are the 4 points that you need to remember. But in the process today, I'll also be talking about different types of researches. What is the process of research in different types of research that are conducted by the researcher, and I'll also explain some of the basic concepts of social science research, and then depending on time, I'll give you what are the different types of biases which creep into research. So that's the basic purpose of today's lecture. Let me tell you that this term research has originated from the French term recherche. The idea of research is to present the complex reality in a very simplified format, and that's why you conduct the research. That the world is very complex, the certain events are very complex, but the idea of research or the duty of the researcher is to present it in a very comprehensible, understandable format. So how do you imagine the research? Allow me to use a metaphor here. I take of research as a cooking. For instance, I'm the master chef, or anybody who does the research is like a master chef. What he does, he imagines the meal that he's going to cook. Then he looks for the ingredients that he would like to collect for cooking. Then he'll apply certain cooking method, and then that meal would be tested and evaluated by the other guests who come for the dinner. So that's how you also conduct the research, that you imagine in terms of theories that how you are going to conduct the research. Once you have done the imagination theoretical part, then you look for the data, that what kind of data do you need for that theoretical study that you're planning to do. And once you have the data, then you will have to apply the method. As you applied the method of cooking, so similarly you will apply the method of the data collection, the method of analyzing the data. Whether you plan to do qualitative research, quantitative research, case study research, historical, anthropological. So those are the kind of rules that that you will apply for analyzing the data. And finally, when the dish is ready, when the meal is ready, you serve it to the guest, and the guest will tell you whether the food is high quality or not. So similarly, when you present your finding, when you publish your paper in a journal, so if your research scholarly community or the audience, they will decide what kind of research you have conducted. So it was just a metaphor to make you understand what are the important components of any research. Very quickly, I would also like to explain some of the key concepts that you need to know before you conduct any research. The first is the concept of variable, and variable is important because researchers often confuse between a constant and a variable. Let me give you an example to make you understand why a constant cannot be taken as a cause and why variable is important. A constant, for instance, if somebody falls from the building, right? What could be the possible causes of that person falling from the building? It could be that he slipped off from the building, somebody pushed him, or he was walking in the dark. So these are the possible variables through which you probably understand the cause of that particular incident of falling of that person and breaking the leg. But I'll ask you that why don't you blame the gravity of the earth? You never say that the force of gravity was the cause that person fell down on the earth. You never say that. Why? Because that gravity is a constant, gravity is not a variable. So that's why you always explain in terms of variables, do not try to explain in terms of constant. For instance, geographical territory. Many of the people say geographical territory is the cause of insurgency in Kashmir. I'll ask them that is a constant, that the same geographical territory was there in 1970s, 80s, but the insurgency was not there. So what I'm trying to say is that never take constant as an explanatory variable. You always explain in terms of variable. Variables are of different types. One is A is independent variable, which is more like cause. And then you have dependent variable. Dependent variable is the effect. So cause and effect explained in terms of variable would be independent variable and the dependent variable. Sometimes you also have the intermediary variables. Let me give you an example here so that it becomes very clear. For instance, you study. Why do you study? To get a job. Why do you get a job? To increase your income. Independent variable here, you're getting the job becomes the intermediary variable, and then finally the outcome variable or the dependent variable is the higher income that you have. So you explain or you think in terms of variables. The second concept is hypothesis. What is hypothesis? Hypothesis is a tentative statement, is a kind of a speculative statement where even before you actually started collecting the data, you start thinking of possible explanations or what could be the possible correlation between the variables. So that's what you do when you try to think in terms of hypothesis. Hypothesis can be of three types. I'll come to that later. It can be simple testable statement, it can be comparative statement, it can also be causal statement. When you try to correlate between independent variable and the dependent variable in a speculative format, so that becomes a causal hypothesis. But sometimes it can be just a comparative, and I'll come to that later. Third concept that you need to know is validity and reliability. Validity is the concept where when your measurement has to be valid. For instance, if you want to measure water, the right measurement technique would be measuring it through liter, right? You cannot measure water through, say, thermometer, right? Thermometer is used to measure temperature. So similarly, when you measure the concept in social sciences, sometimes social science concepts are very ambiguous. It's not very clear. For instance, I want to measure the concept of secularism, the institutional efficacy, or democracy, or the global order. So these broader concepts, you need to employ right measurement, right variables to measure the concept. If you do not do that, your research will suffer from what is known in the literature as problem of validity. Your research will not be valid. The second concept is reliability, that your research has to be reliable. Reliability would mean that if A has done certain research using kind of data and certain kind of method, if B employs the same set of data, if B follows the same method, A and B should come to the same conclusion. That would mean that your research is reliable. If A has come to some conclusion, B has come to some other conclusion using the same data, same method, so that means your research is not reliable, and that you need to keep in mind. The third concept is method of inference. When you say something on the basis of what you have observed about something that you have not observed, so that is known as method of inference. Another concept is correlation. Sometimes correlation and causation they are confused by the scholars, when many times they correlation they take correlation as causation. Correlation is a kind of simple association between, say, two variables. That does not mean that one is causing the other. Let me give you an example that in places where you have more crime, you will invariably find more police personnel. So can you say that police personnel, the presence of police personnel is the cause of that incidence of crime? No. Why? Because there is a correlation does not mean there is a causation between these two variables. So one has to be clear that causation is a theoretical concept. Causation is your understanding, your causal explanation, and correlation can be just two of the variables or two of the incidents might be correlated. So correlation is not causation, that you need to remember. Equifinality is another concept that is useful for social science, which basically means that there are multiple causes of the same event. Sometimes I find it very interesting that when people explain revolution is one broad concept, right? But they explain in terms of number of. French Revolution, for instance, is explained by the problem of aristocracy, the kind of feudalism which was there. Then Russian Revolution is explained by different set of variables. Industrial Revolution is explained by different set of variables. American Revolution is explained by different set of variables. So, but the confusion comes because in science we have been trained to believe that H2O leads to water. So water can be caused only by certain set of variable. So in social science, many of the terms are ambiguous. They're loaded with different set of meanings, and because of that, it appears that that one particular concept can be explained by multiple set of by different variables. So that is equifinality that you need to remember. Again, this the object and subject distinction. Scientific researchers tell you that you have to maintain the distinction between the object and subject. What is object and subject? Whenever you do scientific research, you are asked to minimize the subjectivity that you carry. That you are asked to not get influenced by your value system, your judgment, your subjectivity, and you need to eliminate subjectivity to make your research very objective. Although I do not believe that any researcher can completely eliminate the subjectivity from any research, but yes, there are ways how you can minimize the subjectivity, and that way your research becomes more scientific. Another concept that I would like you to know, that the difference between necessary and sufficient condition. A necessary condition, those are the required condition, but they do not make your research sufficient. For any research to become sufficient, you have to provide all the possible explanation which are not just necessary, but then the event becomes inevitable, the outcome becomes inevitable. So you have to provide sufficient condition. Let me give you an example here so that it becomes very clear. Suppose if I want to become the President of India, so the necessary condition would be that I have to be 35 years of age, then I should not be lunatic, I should be a citizen of India. I fulfill that necessary condition, but what is the chance of becoming the President of India? 0. Why? Because I do not fulfill the sufficient condition. Sufficient condition here would mean that I have to have the support of Parliament or the legislature. Only then I can become the President of India. So when I have that support, that means I have the sufficient condition. So now, what are the types of researches? The researchers, in social science we conduct different types of researches. Some of the researches could be just exploratory in nature. When you do a pilot study, when there is not enough of literature available, then you do this what you call exploratory kind of research, very basic beginning of the research. But after that you get into the descriptive, and after descriptive research you can also get into this explanatory research. And in social sciences, in anthropology or also in humanities, sometimes we do discourse-based study, sometimes we do narrative study. So those are the different types of researches which are conducted by different researchers in different disciplines. And also remember that in terms of analyzing the data, you'll see that some of the people analyze the data in qualitative manner, some of them do in quantitative manner, and some of the people use mixed method. All right. So you can also employ mixed method for your research, but depending on the research question and the kind of training that you have, you will employ the kind of research that you want to undertake. Philosophical, if I take you a little deeper into philosophical tradition, although I do not have much time, so I'll not get into it. But there are two very important traditions which influence the kind of researches that we conduct in deeper research in social science. One is the positivist research, and the second one is constructivism or interpretationism. So in positivism, they tell you that reality is out there, you just need to go and find it out. And the other one, just the opposite group of that, they will argue, the constructivist or the interpretationist, they would argue that reality is there, but you never understand the complex reality. You always understand with the help of some interpretation. So that debate has massively influenced the researchers in social science. So depending on whether, if you get into a little bit of philosophy, then you'll understand that why the understanding of philosophy could be helpful for you in understanding the different types of research that you want to undertake. Three, again, components that you need to understand for philosophy. One is ontology, second one is epistemology, and third one is methodology. My focus is on methodology today, but also broadly because, you want to get into ontological part and epistemological part. Or what is ontological part? What is reality? So those kind of questions are ontological in nature. Then what is the nature of existence, right? What constitutes reality and how can we understand the existence? So that question is ontological questions. And when you do fundamental research, so you do get into those philosophical issues also. Epistemology is what constitutes the basic knowledge and how do you get to that knowledge. So that is epistemology. And methodology is the strategy and technique to get to the reality. So these are the if you want to take my take, I belong to the school where I understand that reality is out there, but reality is so complex that you can never understand the complex reality. You always understand with the help of limited resources or with the help of interpretation. So that is something known in philosophy as critical realism, and I place myself in that category. But I'm not getting into philosophy too much here. How do you get to the objective reality? So it can be intuitive, it can be authoritative knowledge or the professional knowledge that you have in the field. It can also be an analogy where you compare, there are some metaphors that you use, so you understand through that. And it can also be through professional knowledge. When you do the review of literature, so basically you try to get to that knowledge through what other people have done. So these are the ways through which you get to the the epistemological question of your research. Now I'm coming to the key part, because all of us are interested in knowing the practical part of research method. So I'm coming to research design, and I'll suggest you some of the ways through which you can improve your research design. All right. So, if I have to tell you what is the process of research design, so it starts with the research question, then it goes to review of literature, and after having done the review of literature, you try to give a rationale or justification for your research. That you have reviewed, you have Googled it out, you have read, gone to the library, and then you have found out that the literature available has certain shortcomings, and then you know that there is something that you would like to know more. There is something which is missing in terms of explanation. So then you give the rationale on justification of your research. So that is, that comes after the review of literature. So if you're planning to do theoretical studies, so then you also try to give certain theories. Theory is nothing but the kind of explanation that you give for your for your research. What are the different components of theory? Different components of theory, as you know, the basic idea of theory is to explain, and the second one is predict. So you also try to predict on the basis of theory. Third is, falsifiability is an important component of theory. Your theory, as Karl Popper told you, has to be falsifiable. If your theory is not falsifiable, that means your theory will not be scientific. So these are the broader things that you need to remember. So theory is broader generalization of the concept, and which applies to all the possible cases that you have within your study. The next point is, once you have the theory in mind, you might want to explain the theory, but you get to the hypothesis. Your hypothesis is primarily derived from theory, and it also guided by the research question, of course. But once you have the theory, you have hypothesis. Once you have formulated the hypothesis, as I told you, in terms of, if your hypothesis is causal in nature, then you try to correlate independent variable with the dependent variable, and then that hypothesis will steer you, it will guide you for conducting the data. Or collecting the data. Then it will, for instance, if you are saying that democracies don't fight, if that is the kind of hypothesis that you're planning to formulate, so then you will collect the data on democracy, and then you collect the data, the absence of fight among the democracies, right? If you think that the pandemic caused economic recession, so then you would like to collect the data on pandemic first, and then how that led to economic recession. So your hypothesis, or the variables that you use for your hypothesis, those variables will help you collect the data, and that once you have collected the data, your data might be quantitative in nature, your data might be qualitative in nature. So depending on how you have collected the data and what kind of training you have, sometimes people do not have quantitative training, sometimes people do not have good qualitative training. So depending on what kind of training you have, you will get into the either qualitative or quantitative. In qualitative research, there are different types of researches. For instance, historical studies are primarily qualitative. Many of the case studies are qualitative. Many of the theoretical studies are also qualitative, but again, in social sciences, as you know, these days, quantitative studies are also becoming popular. So depending on training, you'll decide how to analyze the data. What are the tools that you'll use to analyze the data? If you have quantitative study, then you might want to analyze the data through SPSS. But for quantitative study, you need to have a good knowledge of statistics. If you do not have the knowledge of statistics, then it won't be possible for you to undertake quantitative researches. You also need to know some of the softwares. For instance, SPSS or SAS or other are different tools that are there for analyzing quantitative data. So those softwares also you need to master. Now, coming to how do you, again, I'm repeating the same thing that I started. So what are the major components of research? I'm just reiterating because, I want you to be very clear. One is frame critical question. Second is theory or broader generalization. Third is estimate the type of data that you need, and then scientific analysis of the data. So these are the 4 cardinal points that you need to remember. You can't do any research without that. Now, the question that comes to my mind is that how do you improve your research design? Right? All the people, they know that there is a theory, there is a data, there is data analysis. So how do you improve that? So if you want to improve your research design, you need to, you can do it either ways, and I'm telling you what you can do. First, you can improve your research question. Right? I'll tell you how to improve the research question, but you can, if you ask some novel question, if you ask some critical question which have not been asked by the previous scholars, so that means you are asking a good research question. The second would be you can improve the theory. Right? If your theory, for instance, covers more data, more cases, or if your theory explains if you think that the previous theory is not very valid, or if you want to expand the scope of the theory, so there are ways you can improve the theory. There are ways you can improve the data quality. Many of the data which are presented by scholars, they are not valid, they are not reliable, they are insufficient. They provide the necessary condition, but they do not provide the sufficient condition. So if you think that your data is the previous data has certain shortcomings, then you can improve the data. And then, of course, you can also improve the data analysis with good methodological training in qualitative research method or case study or quantitative research method. So if you apply some novel method or some new method, or if you counter some of the existing methods, so those methods can be useful in improving the research design. So, I'm coming to briefly just one, how do you improve the research question? First thing that you need to keep in mind is that you have to ask a question which is relevant to your discipline. If you're from sociology background or if you're from international politics background, so you have to ask a question which can be relevant for your discipline, or it has to be socially relevant also. Many times, there are pure researches which are very fundamental in nature and the knowledge just for the sake of knowledge. So that is also possible, but keep in mind in the beginning you have to ask question which is related or specific to discipline. That's the easiest way to formulate the research question. Ask a novel question for which no systematic study has been conducted. If you ask that novel question, so that means you are asking something new, and that would attract your reader, and then you can also look for new kind of data. If you think that that if you want to challenge the existing question, so that is another way of asking a right kind of question. A question can be useful if it provides more evidence to one side of controversy. Suppose for instance in international politics or political science, there is a debate between liberalism, realism, constructivism, etc. So what if you're asking a question, new question, or supporting just one side, say liberalism or realism, so that will also be an addition to the literature. So you are absolutely within scientific research if you are supporting just one group of scholars, and that's perfectly fine according to research method. Also, sometimes people come from different disciplinary background, so they extrapolate method from one discipline to other. Many of the theories, for instance, which have come in international politics, say Kenneth Waltz, so he was influenced by economics. His theory of market, that influenced his entire thinking of international politics. Some of the constructivist scholars, they were influenced by philosophy or historical methods. So if you are extrapolating one method too new to the other method, and asking questions related to this, that will also be considered an important contribution to the literature. Now the second point, and that was about, first this one was about how to improve the research question. Second, how do you improve the theory? The second point that you need to know, that if you are trying to improve the theory, so then remember one thing, that the basic idea of any theory is to explain and predict, right? So once your explanation is better, so then your theory will be considered better. But how do you make your explanation better? That's the key question. So if there is theory A and there is a theory B, so if theory A explains more data or more cases compared to theory B, so that would mean that your theory is better than the previous theory. Remember one thing, as Karl Popper told you, that your theory has to be falsifiable. It does not mean that your theory has to be false. There is a difference between false and falsifiability. What does falsifiability mean? It means that you have to frame the statement in a way that your statement or a theoretical statement becomes falsifiable. Let me give you an example so that it becomes clear. If somebody says that it's going to rain, and somebody says it's going to rain tomorrow in Delhi, the previous statement is going to rain, that is a non-falsifiable statement, because it cannot be falsified. If it did not rain tomorrow, he'll say that I never said it's going to rain tomorrow. But the second statement that I gave you is going to rain tomorrow in Delhi, that is a falsifiable statement. Why? Because if it did not rain tomorrow in Delhi, then you will come and tell me that you said it's going to rain, it didn't rain, so then your statement is falsified. So that was an example to make you understand the difference between false and falsifiability, and this is the major contribution of Karl Popper, as I told you. So your theory has to be falsifiable. If your theoretical statement is not falsifiable, that means that will not be considered a scientific theory at all. And of course, the internal logical consistency of theory is necessary, and without that you cannot have any theory. So that was about improving the theory. The next question that comes come to my mind is, once you have the theory, then how do you frame the hypothesis? So as I told you, that hypothesis can be of three types. It can be simple testable statement, it can be comparative statement, and it can be causal statement. Let me give you an example so that it becomes very clear to you at the outset. For instance, if I say that the GDP of India is growing by say 8%, so that is a testable simple statement. There is just one variable univariate, which is the growth in the GDP. But sometimes it can be comparative in nature, and that also helps, and that statement can be tested. For instance, if I tell you that China's GDP is growing faster than India's GDP, so there are two variables, the growth of China, growth of India, and in a comparative statement, and that can be tested also. So that becomes, if you're framing that kind of hypothesis, that becomes a comparative kind of hypothesis. Hypothesis can also be of causal type. Causal, I've given you already a number of examples, but for instance, if I say that a pandemic led to the economic recession in the United States of America, so that pandemic is the independent variable which led to the economic recession in the United States of America. So that is a causal statement. So you have to understand, if you read the literature, you know how to frame the hypothesis. But these are the three ways you can formulate the hypothesis. But remember, hypothesis is the speculative statement. It's a tentative explanation that you give even before you actually start the research, even before you start collecting the data. But once you've collected the data, you test the hypothesis. And if your hypothesis is confirmed by the data, then you accept the hypothesis that you have formulated. But if your data does not support the hypothesis, then you reject the hypothesis. So there are qualitative ways of testing the hypothesis, there are quantitative ways of testing the hypothesis. Sometimes people will tell you the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. Alternative hypothesis is actually the researcher's hypothesis, the argument that you support. Somebody says there is no difference in two groups, and then your hypothesis, you say that that there is a difference in income in the two groups. So the statement or the hypothesis that you support becomes the alternative hypothesis. So nothing great, but you need to know. Now I'm coming to data, that what are the different types of data that you need to have for research. So your data, the source of data can be, you can depend on the secondary data. But the better would be that if you have the primary data collection, or if you go and yourself collect the data, if you do it yourself, so that is known as the primary collection of data. You can do it through sampling, you can do it through survey, you can do it through interviews, online interview or offline interviews, person-to-person interviews, so focus group interviews. So there are different ways of collecting the data, and then you'll have a sample, and then you'll try to analyze on the basis of sample. So all of that you need to know if you're planning to do the primary collection of data. Again, as I told you, that nature of data analysis can be qualitative, it can be quantitative. There are indirect observations which are done by many of the social science researchers. For instance, historians, they do go to archives. Because the historical materials are available in different museums or archives, so they go to archives to conduct the data. And some of the institutional data set is also available. For instance, if I'm working on the GDP, so I might want to get the government data or the IMF or the World Bank data. So those are the institutional data set. Sometimes some institutions consider that kind of data set primary, but most of the times you'll find that in the literature, only if you go and collect the data yourself, so that would be considered the primary data. Otherwise, otherwise it would be considered the secondary data. And data quality, as I told you, that the data quality would mean that you have followed the two concepts that I explained to you, validity and reliability. Yeah, the measurement has to be valid, and reliability would mean that with repeated kind of research, the conclusions or the findings should be similar. So you have to check whether your data is valid or not. You have to check whether your data and data analysis that you do is reliable or not. So once you've done that, that would mean that your analysis is scientific, and that would be considered by the scholars in your field. Process of data collection and reporting has to be made public. Many times, you say that I've done the research, I've conducted the data, I've collected the data, but I don't want to make it public. No, your research is for the public. So you have to ensure, maybe you don't want to share the exact data, but you'll have to tell the people that how have you collected the data and how have you come to this kind of conclusion. If you do not do that, then if you're not transparent as far as that method and the data collection procedure is concerned, that would mean that other people will not accept your research. So your data has to be made public. The data collection method has to be made public, and also the way you analyze the data, that has to be made public. Collect data. When you're collecting the data, collect data on as many variables as possible. So that was about data. Analysis of data, as I told you, the last point about the research method that I'm talking in today's lecture, it can be qualitative and quantitative. So depending on your training, you can do qualitative researches, you can do quantitative researches. Do not ever think that qualitative research is better than quantitative or quantitative research is better than qualitative, because the logic of inference, it has been established now by philosophers, by scholars, that logic of inference in both qualitative and quantitative researches are the same. They follow different tools to analyze the data, but the logic of inference is same for qualitative as well as quantitative data. But if you're doing, in fact, many of the researchers, they employ both qualitative and quantitative, and that is known as the mixed method. You'll find that people do statistical analysis and then they come to the mix, they also do case studies. So they employ a mixed method of data analysis. Finally, if you are planning to do this statistical method, as I told you, then you'll have to have training in statistical method. You need to know the measures of central tendency. You need to know correlation, confidence interval, p-test, z-test, etc., chi-square. So and also you will have to learn one of the softwares, as I told you, either statistical software, SPSS, or SAS, or any other software through which you can analyze the data. So, and last point that you need to keep in mind, that you have to control the subjectivity in your research, especially when you're doing scientific research. Your research should not be ethnocentric. You should not be judging the other researchers or judging the people or the subject on the basis of your own subjectivity. So if your subjectivity is influencing the research, your research is likely to be biased. Again, to minimize the research, you have to set the criteria in the beginning, that how you are trying to minimize the research, how you are trying to minimize the biases. So there are different things that you need to learn. But I'll stop this lecture here by saying that you have to remember 4 cardinal points that I started in the beginning: research question, theory, data, and data analysis. Once you have these 4 points in mind, you will conduct a very good research, and I'm sure all of you are capable of doing that. So thank you so much for today's listening to me. Thanks a lot.